It seems like it's been 40 weeks since you got 40 winks. Your back pain? Unbearable. Tossing, turning, trying to find that pain-free position. And that's the moment you realize you can't spend another waking moment putting off treatment.
The Joint and Spine Center is Cincinnati's leading destination for spine care, with a ton of surgical and non-surgical treatments for back pain. So when a moment has the power to change the rest of your life, go to the one place with the power to change it for the better, the Christ Hospital Health Network. This changes everything.
The Pound This Podcast is brought to you by the Christ Hospital Health Network. This is the Pound This Podcast, episode 588, Marathons and Mountains with Johanna Garton.
I want to lose weight, but I don't know how to get started.
What should I meal prep every week?
How do I get those sweet booty gains?
Inspiration for your healthy lifestyle. The Pound This Podcast with Amanda Valentine.
Thank you so much for listening to the Pound This Podcast. I'm Amanda Valentine. My guest today is Johanna Garton. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to chat with you because first off, I think that you have a fascinating life. And so as a person that I would define as having a fascinating life, one of the main reasons we're talking is this book that you wrote, Edge of the Map, where you're writing about someone else's fascinating life. I'm like, dang, why isn't somebody writing a book about you?
Oh my gosh, you're so sweet.
So I kind of want to talk about all of the above. So we'll get to the book here in a second, which, it's highlighting mountaineering and this amazing, mountaineering woman, Christine Boskoff. Am I saying her name right? Because I'm reading it and I'm like, I don't know how to say it. So I didn't know her story, and her story is completely fascinating. And I have not done any mountaineering. I'm not a climber at all. I like hiking, but I like not scrambling. I don't like heights.
Not death-defying.
Yes, right? I like a nice safe hike, get a little PB&J sandwich at the top, come right back down.
Yep, you're just like me.
So we'll get to her in a second, but for you, I mean, I know that you grew up in Wisconsin, and so, then you've lived this crazy marathon yoga, living in China, and now you're in Denver, which we were just chatting before recording, because I briefly lived in Denver. It feels like you've had this awesome life. So I guess start at the beginning for me and tell me about you.
Oh my gosh, this is like tables turned, right? We were talking about this before we came on, because I'm a journalist and I'm a writer. So I'm a little shy to talk about myself, but I'm happy to, so I can sort of dive in. I am from Wisconsin. I live in Denver now, but I grew up in Wisconsin in a kind of a small to medium-sized town, had a very traditional Midwestern life. And then I went to college at Syracuse. I studied journalism, and I graduated with a degree in journalism, but I had gotten the travel bug during college, which oftentimes I think happens for people in college. They either study abroad or something about them. They kind of develop this sense of wanderlust. So after college, I had this choice. I could either take a fancy job. I had gotten an offer from the Los Angeles Times on the sports desk, or I could travel. I wanted to see a little bit more of the world. So it was kind of like, what should I do? And I picked the travel option. So I lived and worked in Taiwan for a couple of years, and I just fell in love with Asia. Came back to the U.S. I had been a runner in college, so I continued running when I got back from China, and I went on this crazy journey of marathoning, ran one, and then now eventually I've run 25. Went to law school, did that for a little while, eventually ended up in Denver with my husband. We adopted 2 kids from China and eventually moved over to China, where we lived for a year, and that was kind of the basis for my very first book, which then sort of ended up creating a second book. And that's the journey in a nutshell.
That's crazy. I like that just law school is just tossed into the mix there. Yes. Between, writing and traveling and marathoning of I guess I would try law school.
Right.
Have you ever practiced law? Or did you try it and you're like, nah?
Very briefly, I tried it for a minute. I'm very happy I went to law school because I knew that I wanted to get better at writing and advocating, and that I was going to be passionate about things in my life. And so those are the skills that law school taught me. I focused on international human rights law in law school. And so I practiced very briefly, but it was pretty clear right away that I had a different path in store.
So are you still running marathons?
I am. Yes. And I just turned 50, which is crazy. And everybody sort of says, oh my gosh, maybe you should stop. Maybe you should do halves. But I just love running, and the process of training is just a place of peace for me. So I'm just planning to continue as long as I can.
How are your knees doing?
They're doing well.
Yay.
Amazingly, right? I think because I started running when I was like 10 years old, I think my bone density is actually better. People don't believe me, but I think that there's something to that. That's, my body has been trained for so many decades that I'm actually doing okay.
Yeah, that's awesome. See, I didn't start running until like I was on my own weight loss journey, and I just flamed my knees right out.
Oh, did you?
I
Shoot.
did. But I mean, so I'm fine with walking, but I mean, man, I've done a half marathon. I've never done a full, and I've definitely not done 25 of them.
It's wild.
So what would you say is your favorite marathon that you've done?
Well, there's something special about the first one. The first one was New York City. I did that in 1995. And then I guess I did about one a year ever since. But I did the Boston Marathon in 2017 or 18. And it was a year when Boston in April on this particular day, the high was like 92 degrees. And it was crazy and intense. And I was kind of crying for most of the marathon. And so it normally would be one that people would think would be just a terrible experience. But for me, I was just so glad to be able to finish and know that my body could achieve that. That was really powerful. So that might be my favorite.
That's awesome. So I didn't hear mountaineering and the crazy list of things that you've done in your life. So what made you think I'm going to write a book about a mountaineer and mountaineering?
Yes, you did not hear that. And you're right. I'm not a mountaineer nor a climber. I do live in Denver, so I am in the mountains hiking like you a lot, but I'm not one that, has any aspiration to climb to the top of Mount Everest. So the story of how I got the book is really interesting. I was here in Denver in December of 2006, and I got a call from my mom, who is back in our hometown in Wisconsin, and she said she had read a little article about a mountaineer named Christine Boskoff who had gone missing with her climbing partner in Western China. And she was this very accomplished mountaineer, and Mom asked if I had ever heard of her, and I had not. And as my mother sort of started describing the story and her career and where they had gone missing, which happened to be an area near where my son had been born in China. As I mentioned, my kids are both adopted from China. My mom just sounded really compelled with this story. And I stopped her and asked, well, why are you so interested in this woman? You're not a mountaineer either, Mom. And she said, because you went to high school together, which just sort of took my breath away because I had not heard of Christine or her career at all. And it was ultimately because she was just an incredibly humble woman. So it's not a spoiler to tell you that Chris and her partner, Charlie, died in an avalanche in 2006, and eventually their bodies were recovered and brought back to the U.S. My mom, who was a writer, really felt like this should be a book. And so my mother started working on this book and worked on it for about 10 years. And in that time, she was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And so at the point where she realized she couldn't finish the book, I had just published my first book and was looking for a second project. And so at that point, my mom turned the book over to me with the hopes that it would be published. And it was published in April.
Yeah, how exciting. Which
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about the process of writing here in a second. But first, let's talk about, Christine's life, because again, like I mentioned, I had not heard of her before. And this chick's a total badass.
Total badass.
And I'm like, talk about, just if anybody's done any sort of even low level climbing, like going to a rock climbing gym, that is hard. One of my friends is into climbing, and that is a hard pass for me. My upper body strength does not allow me to. That fear of heights doesn't allow me to do even just the most basics. And this woman just had so many accomplishments. You wrote the book on her, so I'll let you tell, kind of a little bit of her story.
Yeah, she totally crushed it in her professional life and in her personal life in all sorts of ways. She had grown up in Wisconsin, elevation 500 feet, not very high. She had graduated college and ended up at as an aerospace engineer at Lockheed. And this was in the late 90s. And she was leading teams of men. So she was always kind of breaking barriers from the very early stages of her life. When she was at Lockheed, she fell in love with the sport of mountaineering through an interaction she had with a guy named Keith Boskoff, who she'd later marry. She and Keith bought Mountain Madness, which is an adventure guiding company out in Seattle. And they bought that company from Scott Fisher, who a lot of your listeners may remember because he was a mountain guide who died on Mount Everest in 1996. And a lot of people remember him through the lens of John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, which I think is a very famous book that a lot of people have read. So Chris and Keith ran this mountain guiding company, and she began climbing these very high peaks all over the world. There are 14 peaks in the world that are over 8,000 meters. And she eventually summited 6 of those, which she set that record in the year 2000. And it's a record that still stands today. No other American woman has summited more 8,000 meter peaks than Chris Boskoff 20 years later. So she had just had this really fascinating rise in her life and in her sport. And because she was a woman, she was always recognized for her achievements, but she very much didn't want her gender to define those accomplishments, which she worked really hard at all her life to sort of be recognized for what she had achieved and not for the fact that she was a woman who had achieved those things.
Yeah, I mean, what's crazy to me, because I haven't finished the book yet, but just even like one of these first really big challenging climbs that she did, I mean, other people are like dying and being buried on the mountain and be like, yeah, I'm going to keep doing this. I'd be like, no, if I'm going to hard pass and watching my friends die, like, oh my God, like that's crazy to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so
ultimately she was just really passionate about what she did. It's hard for those of us who don't love that sport to really wrap our heads around it. But for her, it was just something she needed to do to feel alive.
Yeah. And it's just like, again, the perseverance and just, I mean, the training that you have to do to have your body physically ready to do anything like that, where it almost feels like, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, just kind of with Everest now, it's like almost like this feels like this toss away accomplishment. It's like, oh, people go hike Everest and you don't really think about how insanely hard that is unless you watch like a documentary on it, where it's just kind of like, I mean, just hiking to base camp of Everest could kill you. It's just insane to think of like, that's just one of these peaks that she did. And then like in the book that you wrote, like one of them where she completely like smushed and smashed her whole hand, saving her husband from a fall. I'm like, and things like that, that so many other people would be like, okay, I'm done. Like, I'm not going to pursue this anymore. Maybe I'll take up, I'm going to start needlepoint or something.
Exactly. Baking sourdough sounds better.
Yeah, right. So like, it's just this crazy, and I think it's so fascinating to me, this woman's life. And it's also fascinating to me of me reading this book, of thinking of like you writing it, of like the amount of research that goes into this. Cause I mean, you're writing conversations that are happening and all these networks of people that she knows. And it's like, cause it's a story. And I'm like, oh my God, I was thinking of the intense amount of work that you've had to put into it. Like, what did that look like? Imagine doing all of these interviews and everything else that went into it.
Yeah, it was an incredible amount of work. And I think, as so often happens with writers, sometimes we get into projects not really knowing how deep we're going to fall into the story. And that definitely happened for me. I picked up my mom's research and started thinking, okay, well, this is going to, this should take 6 months or something. I can whip it out. And then I just started talking to people, and one conversation would lead to another. And before I knew it, I had probably talked to 75 or 100 people, friends of Chris and her husband, Keith, and her climbing partner, Charlie, and Scott Fisher. And so pulling all of those pieces together and all of those conversations and those memories that people had about those individuals, and then writing it as a story, because it really is an adventure story as opposed to what usually sounds like a biography. Some people are describing it as a biography, but that's not how I describe it. It's really a riveting mystery and a romance. And just an adventure story. So pulling it all together was a labor of love and did take several years and many trips to Seattle, many trips to Telluride, where Chris and Charlie lived at the end of their lives, and then also a trip over to China because I wanted to really retrace the last steps that they took in that journey.
So what was that like, the trip to China and going to the place where she died?
Yeah, so that was incredibly emotional for me to walk those steps that she took. And they had traveled to a very remote part of Western China. As you mentioned, those big expeditions are now kind of jam-packed with people. And so she had gotten very interested in traveling to places that were remote, because part of why she liked mountaineering was just to be out in nature and understand the communities that she was in and meeting people. And that was becoming less something she was able to do on those big expeditions. So this was a very remote part of China. So it took me quite a few days and almost a week to actually get to the mountain they climbed, because the elevation was so high and you have to kind of acclimatize to be able to get there. And then it was just a place of beauty and peace. And I think it really helped me understand why she did what she did. So very, very magical. And hopefully I was able to weave that into those last chapters.
So is this something, whenever the book is finally finished, that you kind of send it before you publish to the people that you've interviewed, and kind of everybody, like, does everybody agree that this is kind of how she would want her life represented?
Yes, absolutely. I think you have different kinds of journalists in life, and I'm definitely one of those who wants to talk to as many people as possible and then run sections past people to verify the authenticity. I didn't come into it kind of knowing what I was going to write and wanting that conclusion. I came into it with a blank slate and wanted to wrap my arms around all of these people to have them engaged in the story. So it was arduous to send sections to people over and over to get it just right. But I think it makes for a better read for the reader.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, that's where I think it's so interesting as a reader, where like you said, it doesn't feel like a biography. It feels like a story. Like, you're being pulled along. It's not like reading an instruction manual. You know what I mean? It's like you're pulled into the story and you understand her and the people around her, which brings me to my next question is, with all of these people that you met, does it kind of give you a sense for all of these people in the mountaineering community and kind of the people that she's surrounded with, of just kind of what this lifestyle is like?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I came into the project with that question that a lot of non-mountaineers have, which is why? We've talked about this, like, why would you do this? Why would you put yourself at risk? It has a propensity to be a very dangerous sport, and oftentimes is a very dangerous sport. So why? And now that I've spent so much time in this world, I definitely understand that mentality a little bit better. And the way I usually describe it is, if we're lucky in life, everybody has something that they're incredibly passionate about, and it looks different for everybody. And for most of us, it's something quote unquote normal. It's parenting, or it's yoga, or it's writing, or gardening, or fostering animals, something that's a little more mainstream and not so dangerous. And for mountaineers and climbers, it's this desire to climb. And I think because the sport is dangerous, a lot of people have the ability, or feel like they have the ability, to be able to judge and say, why would they do that? That's dumb. That's crazy. But it's really just a passion, like any of us have a passion about anything else in our lives.
Yeah. And it's just, it feels like with anything else, like once you kind of get that first hit, like you hit that first summit, then you're just hooked. And then, like, from at least my understanding from what I've read so far, kind of it feels like everybody is just, okay, I'm going to work my job to make money just to climb. So like everything is just so I can go get this hit. And I'm glad that you brought this up, of her trying to find a more remote location. Because I'm the same way with just my generic hikes. Like, I get trail rage. I'm like, I came here to chill out and to find nature. And if there's just so many people on trails, especially people that are like jamming speakers, I'm like, and it's like, I'm like, oh, I wanted to be here alone. And it feels with like more and more people kind of getting out there. Not that I'm knocking that, of how, like, it feels like this sport could get even more dangerous with the more people of trying to find more remote locations to get away from all of these crowds. Then you're going to put yourself in even more danger of like, well, I'm going to take this path less traveled so it's not overpopulated, but then, who knows what can happen from there.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Technology has advanced such that there are certain things that are a little safer now. Mountaineers and climbers can sort of predict the weather a little bit easier and they have better gear. But the whole world of climbing and mountaineering is so much more populated that does cause frustrations and danger sometimes.
Yeah. So, I mean, just like thinking of like her life, and all of these other mountaineers and climbers and done this, I feel like, because, the risk of death is pretty high, but it's like, well, it feels like that is a life well lived then. Like, it's like they died, they knew the risk, but they were doing something that they were so passionate about. And I'm not sure how many of us could say that of like, I just like truly lived this life and it took me out, but that was, but I truly lived, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that's the challenge for all of us, right? To be able to find that place where we're happiest and just pursue that no matter what the noise is outside of our world about how dangerous it is or how crazy it is, whether it's something like yodeling or mountain climbing, find that thing that you love and pursue it.
So has this given you any desire to try to summit a mountain or climb anything?
No, actually the opposite. The opposite. I think I know so much now about that world and the dangers that I am perfectly happy, just like you, with my peanut butter and jelly sandwich and going out on a trail that's quiet, and that'll do it for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. So what do you feel like is next for you, and back to your journey in your life? Like, what's on the docket up next?
Well, I do love writing, and now I've got 2 books under my belt. I've got Awakening East, which is the first one, and this second one is Edge of the Map. And I think there's a third or maybe a fourth or maybe a fifth in me. So I'm keeping my ears and eyes open for stories. I would love to stay in the world of adventure journalism and write another book similar to this, narrative nonfiction. There has also been a lot of talk about making this into a film or TV series.
Cool. That's awesome.
So that's exciting. And that's not a world I know anything about. And I'm fascinated by that. So I'm kind of hoping to stay on that path for a while and that leads somewhere.
I mean, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but like something like a Netflix sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh,
yeah.
How exciting.
That would be fun, right?
That would be super cool. Oh,
we'll cross our fingers. Yeah.
Awesome. Well,
it's a great story. It has a little bit of everything. It's a mystery and it's a romance and there's adventure and it's, beautiful scenery and all these different places in the world. So I think it would translate well to the screen.
Well, totally. And it's a peek into this life that most of us don't know what it's like. And also just to see, I think it's always powerful to see like just a strong woman that's like, again, she didn't want to make it about a gender role thing, but like I've worked in a very male dominated business for my whole life. So it's like whenever you can like learn to like, hey, you know what, you say that I can't do this, well, watch me sort of attitude, no matter what kind of, things you were in. And she was, it seems like most of her career was a lot based in the 90s, which is different than it is now. It's very empowering to be like, not only was she doing this really hard physical and mental sport, but a sport that was so male dominated where they're like, oh, women, you can't do this high climb. And some of the examples that you used in the book of just how like they're like women weren't like, it doesn't even feel like they were allowed to do a lot of these things for a long time. And so, like just another element to the story of just, here's a woman that is breaking barriers and taking those comments and being like, I'll do what I want and I'll do it better than you.
Yeah, it's true. I think the world is crying out for more stories like that of strong women kind of defying the odds and just living their best lives, especially in worlds that are dominated by men. I think young women and women of all ages really are just drawn to that part of the story.
Yeah. And I even read about you that there's not many women that write books about mountaineering.
Right, right. So that's been an interesting discovery for me, which I should have thought about when I started writing the book, but it hadn't even crossed my mind, really. And so I got sort of halfway through writing the book and I was searching on Amazon, and I'm looking at the top 100 books on Amazon in the mountaineering category, and there are almost no books written by women. And I just thought, well, that's really interesting. And it's ultimately obviously because there aren't really a lot of women in that sport. So it has really brought me back full circle. You know, I mentioned at the beginning that I had studied sports journalism at Syracuse, and this was in the mid 90s. And I was one of the only women in broadcast journalism, certainly in sports in those years. And so it's really kind of brought me back full circle to be myself in this area now as one of the only women who's published a book in kind of the mountaineering genre, which is really fulfilling.
Yeah, that's super awesome.
Yeah.
So if somebody wants to find this book or both of your books, where do they find you?
They can go to their local independent bookstore, which I always recommend because independent bookstores are wonderful, beautiful places, and they're having a hard time right now, obviously. So they can go there. They can obviously find it on Amazon or any of those big box online stores. And then they can also find it on my website, which is johannagarton.com. And they can find both of those books there. And they can find me and email me. I'm a really accessible author. I've been doing a lot of book clubs. People have been picking up the book and loving it and then having their whole book club read it. And I've been doing Zoom meetings with book clubs when they're done reading it because people tend to have lots of questions for the author when they're done. And a lot of times book clubs don't get a chance to talk to authors. So that's something I've really enjoyed doing. So they can find me for that.
That's super cool. I was just in a Pilates class a couple days ago and they were talking about their book club. So I'll have to throw you out there.
Yeah,
so they can talk to the author. That is super cool. I have not heard of any book clubs, unless you're like Oprah, right. That's going to do a sit down with the author.
Yes, I do that. And I really enjoy it, especially now because I released April 1st. So my whole book tour was canceled. And like everybody, I've been at home for 6 months. So connecting with readers that way has been really lovely.
Awesome. Well, it was so great getting to know you and getting to know more about the history of you writing Edge of the Map. And I hope everybody listening buys a copy, puts it in your book club, and then you can come Zoom meeting the book club.
Yes. Sounds like a plan.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Amanda.
For info on health coaching and more, go to AmandaValentineBites.com.